Jack Thornton stared at the white bone jutting through his blood-soaked jeans and whispered the words every man fears in the desert. "I'm done for." Then his copper mare did something that should have been impossible for any animal to comprehend. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert had no mercy for mistakes, and Jack Thornton had made a fatal one. The afternoon sun beat down on the Arizona territory with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance like water, turning the red rock formations in the distance into wavering mirages that promised relief, but delivered only more scorching emptiness. Jack lay on his back in the hard-packed sand, his right leg twisted at an angle that sent waves of agony through his entire body with every shallow breath. Blood seeped through his denim jeans where bone had punctured skin, darkening the fabric in an ever-widening circle that attracted flies already buzzing in lazy, patient circles above him. He had been tracking the wild Mustang herd for 3 days, pushing deeper into the backcountry than any sensible man would venture alone. But Jack Thornton had never been accused of being sensible, not when it came to horses. At 42 years old, he had spent nearly 3 decades breaking, training, and understanding horses in ways that seemed almost supernatural to those who watched him work. People said he could gentle a wild stallion with nothing but his voice and his patience, that he understood the language of horses better than he understood the language of men. His reputation had spread across 3 territories, and ranchers would pay top dollar for a horse that had been trained by Jack Thornton's hands. The chestnut mare standing over him now, her reins trailing in the dust, had been his constant companion for the past 7 years. He had named her Copper for the way her coat caught the sunlight, turning it into liquid fire. She had been born on his small ranch outside of Prescott, the daughter of his best breeding mare and a wild Mustang stallion he had captured after a week-long chase through these same unforgiving hills. From the moment she had struggled to her feet on shaky foal legs, Jack had known she was special. There was an intelligence in her dark eyes, a spirit that combined the best of her wild heritage with the loyalty of her domesticated bloodline. Now, as he lay dying in the desert heat, Jack could see that intelligence in her eyes as she nickered softly, her muzzle dropping to nudge his shoulder. The smell of his blood had her nervous, her nostrils flaring, but she had not run. Any other horse would have bolted when he fell, spooked by the sudden violence of the accident and the scent of injury. But Copper had stayed, circling back despite her fear, despite every instinct telling her to flee from danger. The accident had happened so suddenly that Jack's mind was still trying to piece together the sequence of events. He had been riding along the rim of a shallow canyon, following the tracks of the Mustang herd, when Copper had stumbled on loose shale. It should not have been catastrophic. She had recovered her footing quickly, her sure-footedness saving them both from a tumble down the rocky slope. But in that moment of stumbling, a rattlesnake that had been coiled beneath an overhang struck out in defense, its fangs sinking into Copper's shoulder. The mare had reared in pain and surprise, and Jack, caught off guard, had been thrown backward out of the saddle. He remembered the sensation of weightlessness, the sky and ground exchanging places, and then the sickening crunch as his legs struck an outcropping of rock. The pain had been immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot explosion that drove consciousness away for precious seconds. When awareness returned, he found himself on his back, unable to stand, watching Copper dance away from the snake before returning to stand guard over him. That had been 3 hours ago, or maybe 4. Time had become difficult to measure, stretching and contracting with each wave of pain and the increasingly powerful effects of the desert sun. Jack's canteen lay somewhere beyond his reach, knocked away in the fall. His rifle was still in its scabbard on Copper's saddle, useless to him now. His voice, when he tried to call for help, came out as little more than a cracked whisper that would not carry beyond the nearest rocks. The nearest ranch was 15 miles to the east, the nearest town 25 miles north. No one would be looking for him for at least another week when the supplies he had taken were expected to run out. "I'm done for," Jack whispered, the words barely audible even to his own ears. The admission felt strange on his tongue, acknowledging a truth his mind had been avoiding since the moment he realized he could not stand. He had survived so much in his life. He had weathered the Civil War as a young cavalry scout, had endured fever and infection, had broken bones and healed from knife wounds earned in saloon fights during his wilder years. But the desert was different from human enemies or battlefield injuries. The desert killed slowly, methodically, stealing water and strength. Until there was nothing left but sun-bleached bones, Copper shifted her weight, her shadow momentarily falling across Jack's face and providing blessed relief from the sun's assault. She lowered her head again, her warm breath stirring the dust near his cheek. There was something almost human in the way she looked at him, a connection that went beyond the simple bond between man and animal. Jack had raised her from birth, had been the first human she had ever seen, had taught her to trust human hands and human voices. In return, she had given him 7 years of perfect partnership, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, responding to the slightest pressure of his legs or shift of his weight in the saddle. Now, as his vision began to blur at the edges and the pain in his leg grew distant and strange, Jack found himself thinking about all the times he had relied on Copper's instincts. She had warned him of coming storms by growing restless in anxious hours before the first clouds appeared. She had detected the presence of predators long before his human senses could perceive any danger, her ears swiveling and her muscles tensing beneath him. She had found water in country so dry that Jack would have sworn there was none within 50 miles. The thought triggered something in his fading consciousness, a spark of hope so faint it was almost extinguished by the crushing weight of despair. Copper knew the way home. She had traveled these trails dozens of times, her memory of landmarks and paths far superior to any map a human could create. But could a horse understand that her rider needed help? Could she comprehend the urgency of the situation, the fact that without intervention Jack would die before sunset? Jack tried to lift his hand toward Copper's muzzle, wanting to touch her one last time, but his arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The movement sent fresh agony lancing through his broken leg, and he gasped, tasting copper and dust in his mouth. His lips were already cracking from dehydration, and he could feel his tongue beginning to swell. The human body could survive 3 days without water, he knew. But in this heat, with his injuries draining his strength, he would not last until nightfall. The mare had moved away from the rattlesnake's strike point, but Jack could see the twin puncture wounds on her shoulder, already swelling and inflamed. The venom would be working through her system, not enough to kill a horse of her size, but enough to cause pain and weakness. Yet she remained standing over him, occasionally stamping her feet and tossing her head, but never straying more than a few feet from where he lay. Through the haze of pain and heat exhaustion, Jack's mind wandered back to the day Copper was born. It had been a spring morning, the kind that made a man believe in new beginnings and second chances. The foaling had been difficult, and Jack had stayed up all night in the barn, ready to assist if needed. When the chestnut filly finally emerged, wet and trembling, he had been the first thing she saw. The foal had imprinted on him in those crucial first moments, and from that day forward, there had been an unbreakable bond between them. He had trained her differently than he trained other horses, with more patience and a gentler hand than even his usual methods employed. He talked to her constantly, explaining what he was doing and why, knowing that she could not understand the words but hoping she might grasp the intention behind them. When she was old enough to accept a saddle, he had taken months to prepare her, ensuring that every experience was positive, every lesson learned without fear or force. The result had been a horse that responded to him as if they shared one mind, anticipating his commands before he gave them, trusting him completely even in situations that would have panicked a lesser-trained animal. Now, as his consciousness began to fade in and out like a poorly tuned radio signal, Jack wondered if that trust went both ways. Could he trust Copper to understand what needed to be done? Could he communicate to her, even in his weakened state, that she needed to leave him and go for help? The sun had moved perceptibly across the sky, and Jack realized with detached horror that he must have lost consciousness for a while. How long had he been lying here? The shadows were longer now, the heat marginally less intense, but the damage had been done. His skin felt like leather that had been left too long in the sun, tight and painful. His broken leg had swollen to twice its normal size, the pressure against his jeans creating a new dimension of agony that competed with the bone-deep pain of the fracture itself. Copper was still there, though she had moved to stand at his head, her shadow falling across his face. The mare's own injury seemed to be bothering her less now, the initial shock of the snakebite fading into a dull throb that she could manage. She lowered her head, her soft muzzle brushing against Jack's forehead, and he felt the warm exhale of her breath across his skin. The gesture was so tender, so human in its concern, that tears leaked from the corners of Jack's eyes, cutting tracks through the dust that coated his face. "Good girl," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible even in the profound silence of the desert. "You're such a good girl, Copper." The mare's ears swiveled forward at the sound of her name, and Jack saw recognition in her dark eyes. She knew he was speaking to her, even if she could not understand the words. An idea was forming in Jack's pain-fogged mind, desperate and probably futile, but the only chance he had. He had trained Copper to respond to specific commands, both verbal and physical. One of those commands was to return home when released from her duties. It was a simple trick, something he had taught her when she was young, more for entertainment than practical use. If he was working on foot and needed her to get out of the way, he would tap her shoulder 3 times and say, "Home, girl," and she would trot back to the barn. But could he make her understand that this time was different? That home meant salvation, that she needed to go now without him and somehow bring help back? The logical part of his mind knew it was impossible. Horses did not reason that way, did not understand abstract concepts like fetching help or communicating danger to humans miles away. But the desperate part of his mind, the part that was clinging to life with every ounce of stubbornness he possessed, refused to give up without trying. Jack gathered what little strength he had left and raised his hand toward Copper's shoulder. The movement was agonizingly slow, his arm shaking with the effort, but he managed to touch her warm coat. Once, twice, 3 times he tapped, his hand falling back to the sand after the 3rd tap, completely exhausted by the simple action. "Home," he whispered, putting every ounce of urgency and command he could muster into that single word. "Go home, Copper. Home, girl." The mare lifted her head, her ears pricking forward. Jack could see her processing the command, recognizing the signal she had been taught years ago. But she did not move. Instead, she lowered her head again, nickering softly, clearly reluctant to leave him. The conflict was visible in her body language, her instinct to obey warring with her loyalty to stay with her fallen companion. Jack felt despair settling over him like a shroud. Even if Copper went home, what would it accomplish? His ranch hand, Miguel, would see a riderless horse and might assume Jack had been thrown or that Copper had simply wandered home on her own. By the time anyone thought to organize a search party, it would be too late. The desert would have claimed another victim. One more story of a man who pushed too far into the wilderness and paid the ultimate price for his hubris. The pain in his leg had evolved into something almost unbearable, a constant throb that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Jack knew enough about compound fractures to understand the danger he was in. Beyond the immediate threat of bleeding out or dying from exposure, there was the risk of infection. The bone had broken through the skin, and in this environment, with dust and bacteria finding their way into the wound, Sepsis was almost guaranteed if he survived long enough for it to develop. Even if by some miracle someone found him before nightfall, he might lose the leg. He might die anyway from shock or complications during the crude surgery that would be required in a frontier town with limited medical facilities. These thoughts swirled through his mind like vultures circling overhead, and indeed he could see the actual birds beginning to gather in the distance, their dark shapes wheeling against the brilliant blue sky. They knew with the ancient instinct of scavengers that death was approaching this place. They would wait patiently, as they always did, for nature to take its course. Copper suddenly raised her head, her ears swiveling towards something Jack could not hear. The mare tensed, her muscles bunching beneath her copper coat, and for a moment Jack thought she might bolt, might finally give in to the fear and survival instinct that told her to flee from this place of pain and death. But she did not run. Instead, she began to move in a slow circle around him, her hooves stirring up small clouds of dust that settled on his already filthy clothing. Jack watched her through eyes that were becoming increasingly difficult to keep open. The mare was agitated now, tossing her head and pawing at the ground. She would approach him, nuzzle his face or shoulder, then back away, clearly distressed by his immobility and the smell of blood that seemed to grow stronger as the afternoon wore on. It was a behavior he had never seen from her before, and through the fog of pain and dehydration, he tried to understand what she was attempting to communicate. Was she trying to get him to stand? Did she somehow understand that lying here meant death, that movement meant survival, even if the movement was impossible given his injuries? Or was this simply the confused behavior of an animal that did not understand why her human companion would not get up and continue their journey? Jack had spent his life studying horses, learning their behaviors and instincts, but in this moment he felt he understood them less than ever. His vision was beginning to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges like floodwater seeping under a door. Jack knew what this meant. His body was shutting down, conserving resources, preparing for the end. He had seen it before in wounded soldiers during the war, that peculiar narrowing of perception that came just before death. Some men fought it, raging against the dying of the light with every ounce of strength they possessed. Others accepted it with a kind of peaceful resignation, grateful that the suffering would soon be over. Jack found himself somewhere between those two extremes. Part of him wanted to fight, wanted to find some reserve of strength that would allow him to stand, to mount Copper, to ride for help, even with a shattered leg. But the rational part of his mind knew it was impossible. The bone had broken completely, the two ends grinding against each other with every tiny movement. Even if he could somehow pull himself into the saddle, the agony would be so overwhelming that he would certainly fall unconscious within seconds, and a second fall could kill him outright. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered to Copper, tears streaming freely down his face now. "I'm sorry I brought you out here. Sorry I got us into this mess." The mare's ears swiveled at the sound of his voice, and she moved closer, her muzzle dropping to touch his face gently. The gesture was so full of compassion, so utterly devoid of blame, that Jack felt his heart breaking. This magnificent creature, who had given him years of loyal service and unwavering trust, deserved better than to watch her companion die in the desert. With the last of his strength, Jack reached up and managed to grasp the trailing reins that hung from Copper's bridle. He pulled weakly, drawing her head down close to his own, and looked directly into her dark, intelligent eyes. "Listen to me, girl," he said, his voice cracking with emotion and dehydration. "You need to go now. You need to leave me and go home. Go find Miguel. Go home, Copper." He tapped her shoulder again, 3 times, each tap weaker than the last. Then, with a supreme effort of will, he did something he had never done in 7 years of partnership. He slapped her hindquarters hard enough to sting, hard enough to startle her into movement. "Go!" he shouted, the word tearing at his parched throat. "Get out of here! Go home!" Copper jumped at the unexpected slap, her eyes widening in confusion and hurt. Jack had never struck her before, had never raised his voice in anger or frustration in all their years together. The mare backed away several steps, her nostrils flaring, uncertain what this behavior meant. She circled him once more, approaching cautiously as if expecting another blow. But Jack's hand had fallen back to the sand, his strength completely spent by that final desperate act. He lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest, his eyes closed against the relentless sun. For several long minutes Copper remained nearby, torn between the command to go home and the powerful instinct to stay with her injured companion. She could smell the blood, could sense the wrongness in the way Jack lay so still, and everything in her nature told her that to leave him would be abandonment. Horses were herd animals, hardwired by millions of years of evolution to stay together, to protect the weak and injured, to never leave a member of the herd behind. The bond between her and Jack was even stronger than typical herd loyalty. He was not just her companion, but the human who had raised her from birth, who had been her whole world for as long as she could remember. But the command had been clear. The 3 taps on her shoulder, the word home, spoken with such urgency, and then the slap that told her to run. Every aspect of her training told her to obey, even when obedience seemed wrong. Jack had taught her that his commands were to be trusted, that even when she did not understand, he knew what was best. The internal struggle was visible in every line of her body as she pawed at the ground, tossed her head and nickered softly to the still form lying in the dust. Finally, with what seemed like great reluctance, Copper turned away from Jack and began to walk toward the east, toward home. After a dozen paces, she stopped and looked back, her ears forward, waiting to see if Jack would call her back or somehow stand and follow. But he remained motionless, and the mare took several more steps. Again she stopped, again she looked back. This pattern repeated itself 3 times, each pause shorter than the last, as if she was gradually accepting what needed to be done. Then something changed in Copper's demeanor. Her head came up, her ears pricked forward with sudden alertness, and she began to trot, then canter, and finally broke into a full gallop across the desert floor. The rain streamed out behind her like ribbons, and her copper coat flashed in the sunlight as she ran with purpose and determination toward the distant ranch that was her home. Jack, drifting in and out of consciousness, heard the thunder of her hooves fading into the distance and felt a mixture of relief and profound loneliness wash over him. At least she would survive. At least she would not die here in the desert with him. Perhaps Miguel would understand when she returned riderless and covered in sweat. Perhaps someone would come looking, or perhaps they would assume he had been thrown and was walking home, that there was no urgency, that he would appear by morning at the latest. The desert silence closed in around him, broken only by the whisper of wind across the sand and the occasional cry of a circling vulture. Jack's thoughts became increasingly disconnected and dreamlike. He remembered his childhood in Virginia before the war, when everything had seemed simple and the world full of promise. He remembered his first horse, a gentle old mare named Molly, who had taught him the basics of riding. When he was barely tall enough to reach the stirrups, he remembered the chaos and horror of the war years, the screaming horses on the battlefield, the friends lost to bullets and disease. Most of all, he remembered the day he had decided to come west, to leave behind the devastation of the post-war South and seek a new life in the territories where a man could build something from nothing if he had the courage and determination. He had arrived in Arizona with $50, a used saddle, and dreams of establishing a horse ranch that would be known throughout the territory for the quality of its animals. 20 years of backbreaking work had made those dreams a reality. His small ranch now produced some of the finest working horses in 3 territories, and his reputation as a trainer was such that men would travel hundreds of miles to buy a horse that had been gentled by Jack Thornton's hands. And now it would all end here, in the desert, because he had been too proud or too foolish to bring a companion on this trip. He had tracked wild mustangs alone dozens of times before, always returning safely, always confident in his own skills and Copper's reliability. Pride, his mother used to say, goeth before a fall. How literal those words had turned out to be. The shadows were lengthening noticeably now, the fierce heat of midday gradually giving way to the slightly more bearable warmth of late afternoon. In a few hours, the desert would transform again, the temperatures plummeting as the sun set, and the clear skies offered no insulation against the cold of space. Jack knew that if the heat did not kill him, the cold certainly would. A man could not survive a desert night in his condition, not with his injuries and the shock that was already setting in. His mind began to play tricks on him, conjuring images that seemed real but could not possibly be. He saw his mother standing in the shade of a nearby rock wearing the blue dress she had been buried in, beckoning to him with a gentle smile. He saw comrades from the war, men long dead, sitting nearby and reminiscing about old times. He saw Copper returning, except she was impossibly huge and she lowered herself to the ground beside him like a camel so he could climb onto her back. The hallucinations were a mercy in their way, distracting him from the relentless pain and the growing certainty of his approaching death. Jack let himself drift into them, no longer fighting to maintain his grip on reality. What did it matter now? Whether he died conscious and aware or lost in fever dreams, the end result would be the same. The desert would claim him, the vultures would clean his bones, and eventually some other traveler might find what remained and wonder briefly about the man who had died alone in this harsh, beautiful place. Time became meaningless. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness, or perhaps it raced overhead in a blur of light and heat. Jack could no longer tell. His periods of consciousness grew shorter and more confused, while the spaces between them stretched into dark eternities where he floated in a void that was neither living nor dead. Each time he surfaced into awareness, he was surprised to find himself still breathing, still clinging to a life that seemed determined to slip away, despite his body's stubborn refusal to quit. At some point, he became aware of a change in the light. The harsh white glare of afternoon had softened into the golden glow of approaching evening. The shadows of the rocks stretched long and dark across the sand, and the temperature was beginning to drop. Jack felt a moment of clarity, his mind sharpening briefly as if his body was giving him one last chance to experience the world before departing it. He thought about the life he was leaving behind. There would be no wife to mourn him, no children to carry on his name. He had devoted his life to horses, sacrificing the possibility of family for the satisfaction of his work. Now, lying here alone, he wondered if that had been the right choice. Would it have been better to have had someone to share his life with, even if it meant less time for his beloved horses? Or had he lived the life he was meant to live, following his passion without compromise? The ranch would go to his younger brother in Kansas, a man who knew nothing about horses and would probably sell the property within a year. All the careful breeding Jack had done, all the bloodlines he had cultivated and refined would be scattered to the winds. The thought brought a fresh wave of grief that was almost as painful as his physical injuries. His life's work would vanish as surely as his own body would vanish beneath the desert sun. A sound intruded on his melancholy thoughts, something that did not belong in the desert silence. Jack tried to focus, to separate reality from hallucination, but his senses were too dulled to make sense of what he was hearing. It might have been the wind or the cry of a bird, or simply another trick of his failing mind. He closed his eyes, too tired to care anymore, ready to let go and drift away into whatever waited beyond the veil of consciousness. But the sound came again, clearer this time, and unmistakable. It was the whinny of a horse, high and urgent, carried across the desert air with a clarity that cut through Jack's confusion like a knife. His eyes snapped open and he turned his head with agonizing slowness toward the source of the sound. What he saw made him wonder if he had finally crossed over into complete delirium. Copper was coming back, but she was not alone. Behind her, connected by a rope she had somehow kept in her teeth, was Jack's pack horse, a steady gray gelding named Smoke, who had been left behind at the last waterhole because Jack had not wanted to slow down his pursuit of the Mustang herd. The mare was trotting directly toward him, her ears forward, her movements purposeful and determined. The rope stretched tight between her mouth and Smoke's halter, and the gelding followed docilely, clearly confused but willing to go wherever Copper led him. Jack stared in disbelief as the two horses approached. It was impossible. How could Copper have found Smoke? How had she known to bring the pack horse back with her? The waterhole where he had left the gelding was miles away, in a completely different direction from the ranch. For Copper to have found Smoke, she would have had to deliberately search for him, would have had to understand that Jack needed help beyond what she alone could provide. The mare stopped a few feet away, dropping the rope from her mouth and nickering softly. She approached Jack cautiously, as if unsure of her reception after having left him. But there was something different in her demeanor now, a sense of purpose and confidence that had not been there before. She had solved the problem in her own way, using resources Jack had not even known were available. Smoke stood patiently nearby, the packs still secure on his back. Jack's blurred vision could make out the shapes of the supplies he had loaded onto the gelding that morning, which now seemed like a lifetime ago. Water, food, blankets, medical supplies, all the things a man needed to survive in the desert. All the things that could keep him alive until real help arrived. With trembling hands, Jack reached toward Copper, and this time she did not shy away. She lowered her muzzle to his outstretched fingers, letting him touch her soft nose, and Jack felt tears streaming down his face once more. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Such a good, smart girl. How did you know? How did you understand?" The mare's dark eyes held his gaze, and in that moment, Jack felt certain that he was witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal intelligence. Copper had not simply run home as commanded. She had assessed the situation, understood that he needed more than just alert someone at the ranch, and had taken action to solve the problem herself. The immediate question now was whether Jack could reach the supplies on Smoke's back. The pack horse stood about 10 feet away, too far for Jack to reach without moving. And movement, as he had already learned, was not just painful but potentially fatal. Every shift of his position sent bone fragments grinding against each other in his shattered leg, threatening to cause more damage to the surrounding tissue and blood vessels. But lying here without water would be equally fatal. He had to try. Jack gripped Copper's front leg, using it as leverage to pull himself forward. The pain that resulted was beyond description, a white-hot explosion of agony that made his vision go dark and his stomach heave. He managed to move perhaps 6 inches before his strength gave out, and he collapsed back onto the sand, gasping and shaking. Sweat poured from his body despite his severe dehydration, and he could taste blood where he had bitten through his lip to keep from screaming. But 6 inches was progress. If he could manage that much again, and then again, he might be able to reach Smoke. Or perhaps there was another way. Jack's mind, sharpened by desperation and the slim hope that Copper's return had provided, began to work through the problem. He could not go to the pack horse, but perhaps he could bring the pack horse to him. "Smoke," he called, his voice barely carrying across the small distance. "Come here, boy, come on." The gray gelding's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, but the horse made no move to approach. Smoke was a good, steady animal, perfect for carrying supplies across rough country, but he lacked Copper's intelligence and initiative. He would stand where he was placed until someone moved him, patient and undemanding, but also unhelpful in a crisis. Jack tried again, making a kissing sound that he typically used to call horses to him. Smoke's head came up and he took one tentative step forward, then stopped. It was not enough. The pack horse was still well out of reach. The precious water and supplies might as well have been miles away for all the good they did him. Frustration and despair threatened to overwhelm Jack once more, but then he felt Copper's muzzle nudging his shoulder. The mare was looking at him intently, then at Smoke, then back at him. Jack saw her nostrils flare as she tested the air, as if trying to understand what he needed. Then, in a movement that seemed almost deliberate, Copper walked over to Smoke, grasped the lead rope that connected the two horses in her teeth, and began backing up toward Jack, pulling the reluctant gelding with her. Jack watched in amazement as Copper maneuvered Smoke closer and closer to where he lay. The mare had to adjust her angle several times, backing and filling like a person parallel parking a wagon. But she persisted until the pack horse stood directly beside Jack's outstretched hand. The entire process had taken less than 2 minutes, and when it was complete, Copper dropped the rope and looked at Jack with an expression that seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for approval or acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. "You're the smartest horse that ever lived," Jack said, his voice thick with wonder and gratitude. "The absolute smartest." He reached up and managed to grasp one of the leather straps that secured the packs to Smoke's saddle. The canteen was there, hanging from a metal ring, tantalizingly close but still just beyond his reach. He pulled himself up slightly, ignoring the screaming protest from his leg, and his fingers closed around the canteen strap. The weight of the full canteen nearly pulled it from his weakened grip, but he held on with grim determination and slowly lowered it to his chest. His hands shook so badly that he could barely unscrew the cap, and when he finally managed to open it, he had to resist the overwhelming urge to gulp down the entire contents in one go. He knew that drinking too much too quickly would make him sick, might even kill him given his current state. Instead, he forced himself to take small, measured sips, letting the water sit in his mouth before swallowing, feeling the blessed moisture working its way down his parched throat. Each sip felt like a miracle, like life itself flowing back into his body. After half a dozen swallows, Jack forced himself to stop and screw the cap back on, though every fiber of his being screamed for more. He needed to make the water last, needed to stay rational about his consumption, but already he could feel the difference. His thoughts were clearer, the fog of dehydration lifting slightly, allowing him to think more strategically about his situation. The medical supplies were also in one of the packs on Smoke's back. Jack knew he carried a basic kit with bandages, laudanum for pain, and a bottle of whiskey that could serve as both anesthetic and antiseptic. If he could reach those supplies, he might be able to stabilize his leg enough to survive until morning, when Miguel would surely come looking after Copper returned to the ranch without him. The thought of Miguel discovering the empty barn, the riderless mare, and organizing a search party gave Jack renewed hope. His ranch hand was resourceful and experienced. He would know where Jack had been heading and would come looking in the right direction. But that was still hours away, perhaps a full day, depending on how long it took Miguel to understand what had happened and gather help. Jack needed to do what he could for himself now, while he still had the strength and clarity of mind to act. He examined the packs on Smoke's saddle, trying to remember which one contained the medical kit. His memory was hazy, and the packs all looked frustratingly similar from his position on the ground. "The left side," he muttered to himself, remembering suddenly that he always packed the medical supplies on the left for easy access. But reaching the left pack would require moving around to Smoke's other side, and Jack did not have the strength for another agonizing journey across the sand. He looked up at Copper, who had been watching his struggles with apparent concern, and an idea formed in his exhausted mind. "Copper, girl," he said softly, catching her attention. "I need that pack, the one on the left side." Of course, she could not understand the specific words, but perhaps he could guide her through gestures and encouragement. He pointed toward the pack, then made a pulling motion with his hand. "Get it, girl. Pull it down." The mare tilted her head, clearly trying to understand what he wanted. Jack repeated the gesture, pointing more emphatically at the pack. Copper moved closer to Smoke, sniffing at the packs, then looked back at Jack, as if seeking confirmation that she was on the right track. "Yes," Jack encouraged. "That one. Pull it." What happened next would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not spent years working with horses and understanding their capabilities. Copper grasped one of the leather straps securing the pack in her teeth and pulled. The strap loosened but did not come free. The mare adjusted her grip, trying a different angle, and pulled again. This time the buckle gave way, and the pack slid sideways on the saddle. Jack held his breath as Copper continued to work at the pack, using her teeth and nose to manipulate it toward the edge of Smoke's saddle. The gelding stood patiently through all of this, accustomed to standing still while being loaded and unloaded. After several minutes of effort, the pack finally slid off the saddle and hit the ground with a soft thump, spilling some of its contents onto the sand. "Good girl," Jack breathed, hardly believing what he had just witnessed. Such a good, smart girl. He pulled himself forward, using his elbows, each movement an exercise in controlled agony, until he could reach the scattered contents of the pack. His hands closed around the medical kit, a canvas roll tied with leather strings, and he pulled it close to his chest like a treasure beyond price. Inside the kit he found everything he needed: bandages, a small bottle of laudanum, the whiskey, a needle and thread for stitching wounds, and a leather strap that could serve as a tourniquet if necessary. Jack's hands trembled as he opened the whiskey bottle and poured a generous amount over his wounded leg. The alcohol burned like fire in the open wound, and he had to bite down on his leather belt to keep from screaming. The pain was so intense that his vision went dark for several seconds, and he tasted blood where his teeth had cut into the leather. When his vision cleared, he examined the wound more carefully. The break was bad, worse than he had initially realized. The bone had not just broken but had shattered, with multiple fragments visible through the torn flesh. Setting it properly would require a doctor with surgical tools and experience, but Jack could at least clean the wound and immobilize the leg to prevent further damage. He poured more whiskey over the injury, then used the bandages to create a thick pad over the wound. The real challenge would be creating a splint. Jack looked around the desert floor, searching for something he could use to stabilize his leg. There were rocks of various sizes, but nothing straight and long enough to serve as a splint. The desert was beautiful but sparse, offering few resources to a man in need. Then his eyes fell on the rifle still secured in its scabbard on Copper's saddle. The wooden stock was straight and strong, the perfect length to immobilize his leg from hip to ankle. "Copper," he called, and the mare came to him immediately. Jack reached up and worked the rifle free from its scabbard, the familiar weight of the Winchester oddly comforting in his hands. He had carried this rifle through countless miles of territory, had used it to hunt game and defend himself from predators. Now it would serve a different purpose, one that might save his life as surely as any well-placed shot. Jack broke down the rifle, separating the stock from the metal action. The wooden stock was smooth and straight, worn comfortable by years of use. He positioned it alongside his broken leg, then used the bandages to secure it in place, wrapping the cloth around and around until the leg was firmly immobilized. Each wrap of the bandage required him to lift his leg slightly, and each lift brought fresh waves of pain that made him gasp and sweat. But he forced himself to continue, knowing that proper immobilization was essential if he was to have any chance of keeping the leg. When the splint was finally secure, Jack allowed himself a small measure of the laudanum, just enough to take the edge off the pain without dulling his senses completely. He needed to remain alert, needed to stay conscious through the coming night. The desert after dark was a different world, full of dangers that a helpless man needed to be aware of. Mountain lions and coyotes emerged to hunt when the sun went down, and a wounded man lying on the ground would be seen as easy prey. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Jack watched the light fade and felt the temperature beginning to drop with the sudden intensity that characterized desert nights. Within an hour, the scorching heat would be replaced by bone-chilling cold, and he knew from experience that desert nights in this season could drop below freezing. He needed shelter, needed warmth, but he had no way to build a fire and no energy to gather the sparse brush that dotted the landscape. The blankets in Smoke's pack would help, but they were still secured to the saddle, and Jack had no way to reach them without Copper's assistance. He looked at the mare, who had settled herself on the ground a few feet away, her legs tucked beneath her in a position that horses rarely assumed unless they felt completely safe. "Copper," Jack called softly, and the mare's ears swiveled toward him. "I need you to do something else for me, girl. I need those blankets." He pointed toward Smoke's saddle, where the remaining packs were still secured. Copper lifted her head, following the direction of his pointing finger, but she did not rise. The mare had worked hard today, had traveled many miles, and used her intelligence in ways that must have been exhausting for an animal operating purely on instinct and training. Jack tried a different approach. He made the soft nickering sound that mother horses use to call their foals, a sound he had learned to imitate during his years of working with horses. Copper's head came up immediately, her maternal instincts responding to the familiar call even though she had never had a foal of her own. She rose to her feet and came to Jack, nuzzling his face with her soft muzzle. "Good girl," Jack murmured, reaching up to stroke her neck. "Now I need those blankets. Can you get them for me?" He pointed again at Smoke's saddle, then made a pulling motion similar to what Copper had done earlier with the pack. The mare looked at the pack horse, then back at Jack, clearly trying to understand what was required of her. What followed was a process of trial and error that tested both Jack's patience and Copper's problem-solving abilities. The mare approached Smoke and began investigating the remaining packs, using her teeth to pull at various straps and buckles. Some came loose easily, spilling contents onto the ground. Others resisted her efforts, remaining stubbornly secure. Jack offered encouragement and guidance when he could, directing her attention to specific buckles or straps. But mostly he simply watched in amazement as his horse worked methodically through the challenge. After nearly 20 minutes, one of the packs containing the blankets finally came loose and fell to the ground. Copper grasped a corner of the blanket in her teeth and began dragging it toward Jack. The fabric picked up dirt and sand as it came, but Jack did not care. When the mare dropped the blanket beside him, he pulled it over his body with trembling hands, feeling the immediate relief as the wool trapped what little body heat he still possessed. There was a second blanket in the pack, and Jack managed to gesture for Copper to bring it as well. When both blankets covered him, he felt marginally better prepared to face the coming night. The laudanum was beginning to take effect, dulling the worst of the pain and making his thoughts slightly fuzzy around the edges. He knew he should try to stay awake, should remain alert for predators and other dangers, but his exhausted body had other ideas. As full darkness fell over the desert, the stars emerged in a brilliant display that stretched from horizon to horizon. Jack had always loved the night sky in this country, far from any town lights that might diminish its glory. Tonight, staring up at the infinite tapestry of stars, he felt simultaneously insignificant and connected to something vast and eternal. How many other men had looked up at these same stars in their final moments? How many had faced death alone in wild places, their lives ending far from home and loved ones? But Jack was not entirely alone. Copper had settled herself beside him again, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her large body, even through the blankets. The mare's presence was more comforting than any fire could have been. She represented hope, intelligence, and the bond between human and animal that had sustained mankind since the first wild horses were gentled thousands of years ago. Jack reached out from under the blanket and rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Thank you, girl," he whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for not leaving me. Thank you for being smarter than any horse has a right to be." Copper's ear swiveled toward his voice, and she shifted slightly, pressing closer to him as if she understood his need for warmth and companionship. The night proved to be as difficult as Jack had feared. The temperature plummeted rapidly once the sun disappeared, and even with 2 blankets and Copper's warmth beside him, he found himself shivering uncontrollably within hours. The cold seemed to magnify the pain in his leg, making the injured limb throb with a deep ache that the laudanum could only partially mask. He drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully asleep, but never fully awake either, existing in a twilight state where reality and dreams blurred together into strange visions. He dreamed of his childhood home, of his mother's kitchen, warm with the smell of baking bread. He dreamed of the war, of cavalry charges, and the screams of wounded horses. He dreamed of the day he first arrived in Arizona, full of hope and determination, believing he could build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. And he dreamed of Copper as a newborn foal, taking her first wobbly steps in the barn while he watched with pride and wonder. Twice during the night he woke to find Copper on her feet, her body tense and alert. The first time, he heard the distant yipping of coyotes and knew the predators had caught the scent of blood on the wind. But they did not approach closer than the edge of the darkness, perhaps deterred by the presence of 2 horses and the unfamiliar scent of human suffering. The second time he woke, it was to the sound of something larger moving through the brush nearby, probably a mountain lion investigating potential prey. Again, Copper's vigilance seemed to be enough to discourage the predator from approaching, though Jack could see the mare's muscles trembling with fear and adrenaline. As the endless night wore on, Jack found himself talking to Copper, his voice a soft murmur in the darkness. He told her stories from his life, memories he had never shared with another living soul. He talked about his failures and regrets, about the woman he had loved and lost before the war, about the friends who had died in his arms on battlefields whose names he could no longer remember. He talked about his dreams for the ranch, about the bloodlines he hoped to create, about his vision of a place where horses could be trained with kindness rather than cruelty. And he talked about her, about how she had exceeded every expectation he had held when she was born. "You're not just a good horse," he told her, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're proof that there's something more to animals than we humans usually recognize. You understood what I needed today. You solved problems. You saved my life." The mare's ear remained turned toward him throughout these one-sided conversations, and occasionally she would nicker softly, as if offering comfort or encouragement. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jack tried to mark the passage of time by watching the stars wheel overhead, but his vision kept blurring and his mind kept wandering. He was aware that his condition was deteriorating despite the water and medical supplies Copper had made accessible. The shock from his injuries was deepening, his body temperature dropping to dangerous levels despite the blankets. His thoughts became increasingly disconnected and difficult to hold on to, like trying to grasp smoke. Several times he was certain he was dying, that the next breath would be his last. Each time, he would force himself to focus on Copper's presence beside him, on the warmth of her body and the sound of her breathing. She became his anchor to life, the reason to keep fighting when every other reason seemed to have fled. If he died, what would happen to her? Would she stay by his body until she too succumbed to the desert's harsh conditions? Or would she eventually leave, wandering alone until she was claimed by predators or the elements? The thought of her suffering because of his foolishness gave Jack strength he did not know he still possessed. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Jack became aware of a new sound cutting through the desert silence. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as another hallucination or trick of his failing senses, but the sound grew steadily louder and more distinct, and Copper's reaction confirmed its reality. The mare scrambled to her feet, her ears pricked forward, and she released a piercing whinny that echoed across the landscape voices. Jack could hear human voices calling his name, and beneath those voices, the sound of multiple horses moving across the desert floor at a fast trot. Miguel had found him. Help had arrived. Jack tried to call out, to add his voice to Copper's whinny, but all that emerged was a hoarse croak that would not carry more than a few feet, but it did not matter. Copper was making enough noise for both of them, calling to the approaching horses with the urgency of an animal that understood rescue was at hand. Within minutes, 3 riders appeared through the pre-dawn gloom, their forms silhouetted against the gradually brightening sky. Miguel was in the lead, his weathered face creased with worry that transformed to relief when he spotted Jack lying on the ground. Behind him came Dr. Patterson from town and a young ranch hand named Billy, whose father owned the property adjacent to Jack's ranch. Madre de Dios, Miguel breathed as he dismounted and rushed to Jack's side. We thought we had lost you, boss. When Copper came back without you yesterday evening, running like the devil himself was chasing her, I knew something terrible had happened. Jack managed a weak smile as Dr. Patterson knelt beside him and began examining his injuries with practiced efficiency. The doctor's face grew grave as he unwrapped the makeshift splint and assessed the damage to Jack's leg, but he said nothing that would increase Jack's fear. Instead, he worked quickly to prepare Jack for the journey back to town, administering morphine for the pain and reinforcing the splint with proper medical supplies from his bag. You did good work on this splint, Dr. Patterson commented as he worked. Probably saved the leg by immobilizing it so well. Where did you learn field medicine? Jack's eyes drifted to Copper, who stood nearby watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Necessity, he managed to whisper, and a little help from my partner there. Miguel followed Jack's gaze to the mare and shook his head in wonder. That horse of yours, boss, she's something special. When she came back yesterday, she wouldn't settle. She kept going to the barn door and back to the house over and over, like she was trying to tell me to follow her. I almost did, but it was getting dark and I thought maybe you had just sent her home for some reason. But this morning, before dawn, she started raising such a commotion that I knew I had to come looking. She found Smoke, Jack said, his words coming with difficulty, brought him to me, got the supplies down, pulled the blankets over. He paused, gathering strength. She understood what I needed, solved the problems herself. The 3 men exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with respect. They had all worked with horses for years, knew the animal's capabilities and limitations. What Jack was describing seemed to stretch beyond those limitations, suggesting a level of reasoning and problem-solving that conventional wisdom said horses did not possess. But the evidence was there before them. Smoke standing nearby with his packs disheveled and hanging loose, the blankets covering Jack, the scattered medical supplies, and most tellingly, Jack himself, still alive when he should have been dead. However it happened, Dr. Patterson said firmly, that mare saved your life and we need to get you to town now before infection sets in worse than it already has. They had brought a travois, a simple wooden frame that could be dragged behind a horse to transport wounded men. Billy and Miguel worked together to transfer Jack onto it as gently as possible, but even with the morphine dulling his senses, the movement brought tears to his eyes and a groan from his lips. Copper moved closer during the transfer, nickering anxiously, and Jack reached out to touch her one more time before they departed. Take care of her, Miguel, Jack said as they secured him to the travois. Make sure she gets extra oats. All the apples she wants, she's earned it. Miguel nodded solemnly. I will treat her like the queen she is, boss, this I promise you. The journey back to town took most of the day, with frequent stops to check on Jack's condition and give the horses rest. Copper followed without needing to be led, staying close to the travois as if standing guard over her injured companion. The mare limped slightly from where the rattlesnake had struck her, but the swelling had gone down, and Dr. Patterson expressed confidence that she would make a full recovery. As they traveled, Miguel told Jack how Copper had behaved after returning to the ranch. She would not eat, he explained. She would not drink, just paced and worried like a mother who has lost her child. I have never seen a horse act that way. This morning, when I finally decided to come looking, she practically pushed me out the door with her nose. Jack listened to these accounts with a growing sense of awe. He had always known Copper was special, but what she had done went beyond anything he had thought possible. She had not just responded to training or instinct. She had reasoned through a complex problem, had taken initiative, had demonstrated what could only be called intelligence in the fullest sense of the word. The next weeks passed in a haze of pain and medicine as Dr. Patterson worked to save Jack's leg. The compound fracture had become infected despite Jack's efforts to clean it, and for several days the outcome remained uncertain. Fever consumed him, and in his delirium he dreamed constantly of Copper, of her finding him in the desert, of her intelligent eyes watching him with concern and understanding. When the fever finally broke and Jack returned fully to consciousness, the first thing he asked about was his horse. Miguel assured him that Copper was fine, fully recovered from her snakebite and eating well. "She misses you, though," Miguel added. "Every day she stands at the fence facing town, like she is waiting for you to come home." 6 weeks after the accident, Jack was finally strong enough to return to his ranch. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, and the leg would ache in cold weather, but Dr. Patterson had saved it. As Miguel helped him down from the wagon, Jack heard a familiar whinny and looked up to see Copper galloping across the pasture toward him, her copper coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The mare skidded to a halt in front of him, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then Copper lowered her head, and Jack wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her mane. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for being everything I never knew a horse could be." In the years that followed, Jack never rode another horse. Copper remained his sole mount, his partner, his friend. He told the story of what she had done to anyone who would listen, though he knew some people thought he was exaggerating or that his memories had been distorted by pain and trauma. But those who knew horses, who truly understood them, recognized the truth in his tale. Copper lived to the remarkable age of 28, spending her final years in peaceful retirement on the ranch she had helped save. When she finally passed away in her sleep one spring morning, Jack buried her on the hill overlooking the desert where she had proven that the bond between human and animal could transcend what anyone thought possible. On her grave marker, he carved a simple inscription that told the whole story in just 5 words. "She understood, and she saved me."